No taxation without representation, a phrase every kid and adult knows. The creation of the phrase no taxation without representation is generally thought to be coined by James Otis. This is the beginning of the American Revolution. Obviously, there were a multitude of things that led to the revolution, but this was one of the largest. On its face, the saying does not sound like much, but when you delve into the history and events going on around it, it makes much more sense as to why this phrase is such a large part of our country's history and why it meant so much to the patriots of the time.
The conflict was started because the King of Britain wanted money for many purposes: to pay for the French and Indian War, to prevent the colonists from moving west, which will lead to another war, and most importantly, he wanted money for himself. There were multiple taxes that were placed in the colonies. The first was Molasses Act. The Molasses Act was set to expire in 1763. The Molasses Act was a tax that forced the colonies to pay 6 pence for every gallon of molasses. Next was the Currency Act in 1751. The act limited the amount of currency in circulation in Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. The following act was the Sugar Act. It was the extension of the Molasses Act. As the Molasses Act expired the year previous, 1763, and they wanted to renew it. The Stamp Act was declared a year later in 1765 and was a tax on all printed documents. The Townshend Act was named after the man who introduced the act to the Parliament. The act was announced in 1767 and taxed the colonists on paper, tea, lead, and glass imported into the colonies. The next act proclaimed was the Tea Act. The Tea Act was the catalyst to the Boston Tea Party. It was passed by Parliament in 1773. It didn't just tax the colonists, it also gave the British East Indian Tea Company monopoly over the colony's tea market. The last act were the Coercive/Intelligible Act. They were acts that were passed in 1774 in retaliation to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty dumped the equivalent of $1 million in tea into the Boston Harbor. The Boston Act shut down the Boston Harbor until the trade company was paid in full the amount of money, all of the tea costs that the Sons of Liberty dumped into the harbor, 324 chests. The Massachusetts Government Act, an act for better regulating the government and province of Massachusetts Bay. The third act of the Intelligible Act is the Administration of Justice Act. It was an act passed in the hope that it will protect British officials charged with capital offense. There was also an act that was made a year later, generally thought to be a part of the Intelligible Act, called the Quebec Act, that gave Canada a permanent administration instead of the temporary government in place at the time, but it also gave the Canadians land that the colonists had already claimed as their own.
The taxes seemed very unfair, and it's easy to emphasize with the colonists. But Britain didn't tax the colonies for no reason. The colonies and Great Britain just fought a war that Britain paid for. The French and Indian War was an expensive war that doubled Britain's national debt, and they decided to take the colonists directly for the first time because of it. Britain also needed money to pay for the soldiers they put on the west side of the colonies to keep the colonists from moving further west, which could lead to another war which they could lose, and would undoubtedly cost Britain just as much as the last one or more. This was the start of the protesting and the war because the colonists wanted to the west of them for themselves. The war cost Britain £70 million. There were trade taxes and laws that the colonists regularly avoided during the war with the French and Indians. So, the colonists, while Britain paid for a war to keep them their own land, went around the laws that Britain put in place. Britain also wasn't just doing this to the American colonies. Most of Britain was also taxed without representation in Parliament.
So the colonies protested, and on 1770, March 5th, the Boston Massacre, known as the Incident on King Street, to the British, where British troops were stationed in front of the Customs House to enforce the unpopular taxes that Parliament passed. Protesters gathered in front of the British soldiers, taunting them and later throwing snowballs and other objects at the British troops. When Hugh Montgomery was hit, he shot the rifle into the crowd, and other soldiers followed suit. When they stopped firing, 5 colonists were dead or would be so soon. These were some of the first few deaths of the upcoming war. The Boston Tea Party was also a form of protest. It wasn't just a mob of people dressed up as Indians and destroying the ship. No, the colonists were just throwing the tea into the harbor. They didn't even break the locks on the chests of tea they threw into the harbor. They were just trying to make a point that the tax on tea was unfair, and until they had someone to represent them in Parliament. In 1774, the Continental Congress met and started because of the coercive / intolerable acts. In the first Continental Congress, they said they were loyal to the king but disputed Parliament's right to tax them. They also called on the colonies to not buy goods from Britain, and if the acts were not repealed by Britain, they would come back together on May 10, 1775. When Britain did not repeal the taxation acts, the Continental Congress came back together, and at that point, the American Revolution had already begun. In early morning, April 19th, British soldiers marched into the towns of Lexington and Concord and went to take the weapons of colonial patriots who had stopped recognizing the authority of the royal government to Massachusetts, put in place by the Massachusetts Government Act. The battle ended with the colonists winning and driving the British Army back to Boston.